I hear what everyone is saying about enthusiasm. I'm also, I think, partly because of the time we're living in, that's a hard quality to muster up right now. So I spent about a year and a half writing a play, and then a year and a half trying to market it. And I had a staged reading at Berkeley Rep on March 2nd, like about a week before everything shut down. And it's really, really hard to launch a new play when you're a new playwright, especially. And also, I'm finding when you're an older person, you're not, I don't have an MFA, I'm not in my 20s, I don't have a mentor in the theater world. So it's really, really, really hard to get it done in the best of times. And now that theaters are shut down and they've canceled their season and things which were supposed to, be on tap now are being pushed back, it feels almost impossible to imagine this play taking off. So anyway, but I still would hate to see all that work go down the drain. So I would like to find the optimism and faith also to find a way to get it. And it's also a historical play, and I'm not sure whether it's about Susan B. Anthony and the early suffrage movement. I'm not sure if that's what people would want to talk about when COVID is over. So it's like, what do I do now?
Great.
And I put so much into it. I don't have another thing right now. That's been my thing for 3 years. So, yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. And Stephen.
Hi, I'm Steven. I'm calling in from Atlanta, Georgia. I found out about this event kind of at the last minute and did not know there was a homework assignment. So I've been scrambling to do it right now. So I think my intention in the near future is to get a very complex and sprawling book out of my head in some kind of presentable, understandable form. I'm trying to summon a decent work ethic and make myself work in a systematic way and actually get the material out and organize it. And I'm also trying to practice what I preach. I'm also a designer. That's how I know Neil, actually. And I'm trying to make myself write empathically so people will care and understand about what I'm writing about.
Right. Well, thank you, Stephen. And just a full transparency. Steve's actually a very, very good friend of mine. He's a partner in some conversations we've been having. I'll be talking a little bit more about design consciousness, and that's sort of really what brought Stephen and I together. And so I'm very delighted to have him here from Atlanta. And at some point, I might have you speak a little bit to the service design aspect of things, but we'll get there. All right. So the Torah of Design. I'm using the word both Torah quite loosely and the word design in a way that we might not be so familiar with in typical. But there are really three things that I'm bringing together in this little workshop. One is Torah, and by that I really mean Torah in the sense of a learning. But we'll go into some of the creation stories of the Torah and try to learn a little bit about what it is that they tell us about this creative intentionality that we have. Um, I will also want to point out that design itself is a learning process. There's a lot of parallel and relationship between learning and creation, because we're constantly putting out something in the world that wasn't known before, and we're learning as we go. It's very intrinsic. A lot of learning philosophy, learning theory, and design theory actually have an awful lot in common. And so the Torah of Design for me has a very particular resonance and depth to it. But the two other aspects that we'll be sort of mashing together here. One is design thinking, as I've said, and the other one, Mussar. So the design thinking part is, I'm presenting design thinking here. Obviously, design thinking was originally developed to deal with tech issues and things in the technology world out here in Silicon Valley and beyond. where people were realizing we're coming into a world of great complexity, and we can't simply be randomly making things up as the human condition has been up till now. And there was an intent all the way back in the 60s, 50s really, to start thinking about a formality to the design process, to the creative process. You might have heard of Buckminster Fuller, who sort of professed and called for a design science. I don't personally like the idea that it's a science or a science of design, because design is very much a matter of the heart rather than of the head, or as much. And you'll be hearing a lot more about that today from me. But many have applied design process as a sort of a life coaching, personal coaching modality. These two books that I've got up on the screen right now are probably the best examples of that. One is by a couple of guys who teach this as a course down at Stanford. The other one is a designer that I worked with many years ago, Asa Bursell, who's a wonderful furniture designer who wrote the title, I would call, if I wrote a similar book, The Design the Life You Love. I would probably call it Design the World You Would Love to Live In, but that's a little thing. The little symbol at the bottom is the diagram that is most typically used to refer to and relate to this process that we're talking about, design thinking. It's a step-by-step process, or it's certainly shown that way in the diagram. And it consists of these 5 very specific steps: empathize, define, ideate, prototype, and test. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that later on. I'd also highly encourage you to check out either of those books, because they sort of embody a lot of what I'm going to be talking about without the Mussar and the Torah part. But they certainly bring plenty of insight and wisdom on the self development aspect of things. And so my touch point for the Mussar, I'm no expert in Mussar, but I have had the opportunity to study it quite a bit at Chokhmat. A number of years ago, 4 or 5 years ago, there was quite an effort to actually bring it into the suite of teachings that Chokhmat embraces. We actually had Alan Marinas come down and present to us a number of times. And this book is considered to be one of the standard texts, if you like, in modern Mussar and practice of tikkun middot, of the repair of the soul. And so it's a wonderful reference point. I'm not going to delve into it at all, but it's worth checking out to represent the Mussar aspect of this whole ensemble that I'm trying to bring together here. So let me just try to cover some of the terminology that I'll be using. As I've said, design for me, the term intentional creativity means design. That's what design is for me. It's how I try to give form to my intentions, if you like. And very often, what we overlook in the design process is what is overlooked very often in the design process is the act of setting an intention is very often way more difficult than the act of achieving it. As skilled designers, once we know what we're trying to get done, and we're really clear and crystal clear about it, giving form to it is the part that comes relatively easy. I'm not denying that there's complexity, and there's certainly plenty of technical complexity to it, and it's very important to master those technical skills relating to whatever it is you're designing. But we tend to narrow down the technical skills of design to images that come really out of the 19th and early 20th century, that designing is about drawing. Designing is about making things pretty. And it is about those things. It can include those things, but they are such a small part of what we're actually talking about here. So I very much like the term intentional creativity. As you can tell from those comments, I do not think that design, I do not relate to the objects of design as design. They're simply the objects of design. The design that we're talking about is not an object. It's not something that you can be attached to. It's not something that you necessarily have to admire or despise. You can decide for yourself whether it's good or it's bad. That is not the point of this. The key point is that design is an activity. It's a process. It's a thing we do. And it's a thing that's akin in the human realm to what evolution is in the natural realm. It's a creative, an ever unfolding creative process that actually never ever ends. As long as we're alive, we're going to be designing because that's what we do. We can't help ourselves. If we stop designing, if we stop creating new things, we will in fact, that's sort of an indication that we're not very alive. Um, so we're talking specifically about the verb design, the activity, the task. And this, we use it all the time, but we don't necessarily relate it to what it is that designers actually do. But we use the expression by design all the time. And by design, we mean with intention. We see it as something separate from the actual design process, but as I'm trying to argue for here, that setting intention is maybe the most difficult, probably the most important part of the design process, and it's the part that is constantly itself changing and being refined and evolving. It's not a static point, and so we'll get back to some more of that. But what we're going to be doing here is the focusing on the but by design aspect of design. And related to that, and we'll talk about it, and again, this is especially important to talk about in the context of the Torah of Design, is the question of creative agency. We have received creation stories and interpret them to mean that all creative acts, the most important creative acts, are those that are performed by somebody else. We don't have the agency of the creation of what is, it just is. The world was created, it just is, and therefore everything in it is just is. And it really removes our sense of agency and control, if you like, that if it's not doesn't suit us the way things are, we can change them. And the things that are the way they are because some other human created it is subject to us deciding it can and should be changed. And that's what I mean by creative agency. So that also comes very, very much into we can change the things that we believe we can change, but if we don't believe we can change it, if we don't have what David Kelly, one of the framers of the contemporary practice of design thinking, wrote a book called Creative Confidence. And if we don't have that creative confidence, it's very often very hard to actually follow through on a creative intention. So let me just tell you a little bit about myself and my background so you know who it is who's telling you this and that I'm just not completely making it up off the top of my head. The first part of my career was after graduating, I got a master's degree, which at the time was a terminal advanced degree in design. Today, design is commonly studied through to a PhD level. The time I was studying, that was still a very new idea. And I actually got my advanced degree in the discipline not of design, but of design research. The idea that there was a particular approach to doing research that wasn't the same as doing scientific research was a very new one. Today it's very well established, and it was on the basis of me being a design researcher initially, as well as an industrial designer, that I was employed by the company Herman Miller. You might be sitting on one of their chairs. You might have worked at some of their furniture. But I arrived there in the very early 80s when Herman Miller had recently transformed the world of work with what we now call the cubicle derisively. But at the top left is an image of the office systems furniture that they brought into the world through a very rigorous design research process that culminated in a product that really changed the nature of work in the world, of white-collar work. But I worked there as an ergonomics specialist, as a chair designer. I worked on a lot of seating programs, and really we didn't see it as that we were designing furniture. We saw it as we were reinventing work. And given that when I was there, was the first day at work, my first day at work, a personal computer landed on my desk, and we were told, figure out what this is going to do. And this was actually before the Apple Macintosh, um, and so we really had some work to do to figure out what the world of work was going to look like once everybody, which we knew then, everyone was going to have one. Um, we didn't quite anticipate quite how mobile they would get, but that's a whole other story which I can tell. Um, but after a few years at Herman Miller, I got restless. I saw things were happening out here in San Francisco, in California, in Silicon Valley, and I was very interested in bringing that kind of research-driven design out here to California, where it really didn't exist. Design at that time in the valley was a decorative discipline. It was designers were brought in after the engineers had done their thing, engineering a product to make it pretty. And I wanted to show a different way of doing that. I arrived here actually in 1989 and set up a firm to be able to do that. And over the years, worked on a wide variety of projects. Obviously, a lot of computers in the computer industry, a lot of medical devices. Um, One I'm particularly proud of right now is if you see this. I don't know if you can, if I can actually point to it, but there's a little there's a kid being given an injection with a device that is actually a needleless injector. That device is currently being used in a partnership with somebody developing a COVID vaccine, and it's actually now a COVID vaccine delivery device that actually I worked. It wasn't me alone, but on a fairly substantial team. We developed that about 7 or 8 years ago. Um, so there's a variety of products. The name of my firm was Praxis, which really is a name, a way of describing the iterative nature of the design process. So very early on, when I gave this firm that name, I was focused on the process, not the product, not the objects that we were designing. I've taught design throughout the years as on the side, starting off with NC State, where I actually graduated, um, and most recently at San Francisco State, where I've been teaching a class in design thinking in the business school, not in the design school. So I've taught in the design school side of things and the business school side of things. And then I've taught design actually in corporations through a firm that I helped co-found, Innovationship, which I've co-founded with some friends and then left, but specifically to teach design thinking to corporations and to consult around the innovation process with that as a foundation. My passion project, where I am right now, is in what I call design consciousness. And this is a different talk, but there's one important thing that I've already mentioned that comes out of that is one is that notion that when we recognize that everything that is not of nature is an artifact of the human imagination, is an object of design, and therefore can be either designed poorly or well, and it's up to us to decide which one we want. So that's my little thing. I'm busy writing a book about that as well, and hopefully, and I'm considering other ways of bringing that out, like this workshop. So let's get to the I'm just going to be talking through if we were in a room, hopefully there'd be some interaction. If anybody wants to interject at any point, please do. I don't really know how to manage the flow of that so well with Zoom. It's Silva, you have a hand up. Please do.
You say designed poorly or well. Is there a set criteria for how you figure out if it's designed well? Do you have a template for that?
Uh, no. Well,
I
yeah,
do,
yes.
Neil.
Huh?
I said I'm actually doing an interview right now with a brilliant designer named Liz Sanders, who
Aha.
proposed a framework that a well-designed thing is useful, meaning it's something that you need that helps you do something you're trying to do. Useful, when you try to use it, there's no obstacles preventing you, such as difficulty physically manipulating it or having trouble understanding it. And then finally, desirable. It resonates with your values. You find it pleasing and good. So she, useful, usable, and desirable is one very popular framework. I think it was an act of extreme brilliance, and I'm writing a little book with her.
Thank you, Stephen. I say yes and no, partly because I, you know, I, I like to think that design, a good design is one that is that furthers the human spirit. And obviously that's even a more vague version of this than the Sanders version. But I like it because it does bring design and the creative process into the spiritual plane, into that plane of there's an ineffable quality to when something is good, and the way we recognize is when we see ourselves reflected in it well. What that means, well, that's why we have why spirituality is such a difficult subject to study and to really get to the bottom of, because it's a constant process of learning and discovery of what it is that we mean when we want to unfold the human spirit. Okay, um, so the let's just talk a little bit about the creation stories and the Torah piece of it. Um, the obviously the primal creation story that most people in in the world really knows. I've asked my Chinese friends, what creation story did you know of? The first one it mentions is this creation story, the idea that the world was spoken into being in 6 days. And again, we're not going to do a whole, it's a whole other workshop to do a deep dive into a design view, how to look at the creation stories of the Torah through a design lens, which I'm fascinated by, and come up with some very, very different interpretations than many of the rabbis do. But that's my prerogative to bring a lens to that. And that's one of the things I love about this tradition. Um, but to me, the key factor is what that the idea of a creation story that speaks the world into existence. There's no fire and brimstone really. It was an ordering process, and an ordering literally in the sense of bringing order into the world and ordering it, commanding it, just saying it, do it, and this is what's going to be. It's language is the gateway to our imagination. And a people who will see the world created by the words, by the word, are people who are deeply in awe of our ability to translate our imagination into reality. These are people for whom it was probably a fresh recognition that every time they built something new that didn't exist, like a tabernacle, like a temple, were bringing something from their imagination into existence, and it must have seemed to them to be an absolute act of magic. There was no other way to explain that or to understand it other than to attribute it to a force greater than themselves. But it also teaches us that we need to really respect and honor that act of bringing our imagination into the world, that translation between something that is floating around purely in the imaginative realm. It doesn't exist other than in our own consciousness until we bring it out. We can first verbalize it, but the next step is to actually actualize it. And that very much to me is at the bottom of my understanding of the design process. This is I view Noah's Ark as a creation story, but it's not very often seen that way. And the reason I see it is because I'm a designer and I design things like ships. And that's creation. And this is the first time in the Torah that there's actually a detailed description, there's a specification for a design. A purpose is stated. The purpose is to gather all the animals two by two and float them above a great flood that is going to annihilate and purify the earth. That is an awe-inspiring and awesome intention, solved or addressed with the creation of a particular artifact, an ark. And there's one thing, and I just want to introduce this as what I get from this story, one of many things, but I want to focus on this piece, is the first thing that is said about God choosing Noah in particular to make this. Now you have to understand, to make an ark like this takes a considerable amount of technical skill. And you think, okay, the technical skill is the thing by which he gets chosen. There's not many people around who can build, certainly then, an artifact of such immense complexity. And the thing it says to him is, Noah was a righteous man, blameless amongst the people of his time, and he walked faithfully with God. So being a blameless man became the primary criterion for a designer, for someone who was going to make something and bring it into the world out of his imagination. We'll come back to that as a theme. This is also not very often seen as a creation story, but again, I think the link to architecture might be a little bit more explicit and direct. The Tower of Babel was also a story about language and that interpretation of what the language that we use to translate our imagination into reality. Except there's a particular quality, again, that was at the center of this creation story, which was creative hubris, our tendency to want to glorify ourselves in the things we create. And that clearly did not find favor in God's eyes. So we were punished, except I don't view it so much as a punishment, but we were given many languages. We were given many ways of approaching the challenges of adaptation to our environment through creative means. And I think there's a lot to be learned from the story beyond the fact that it was a prohibition on building any kind of grand building. And so, again, I don't have time, we're going to rush on, but that is a very profound story to me about the injunction to not just create things because we can, but to create them with a deep wisdom, and especially the wisdom of not of hubris, of not falling prey to hubris. And the story that really is the reason why we're here today is everything. We're here to celebrate the Torah, it's Shavuot, and we're here particularly to celebrate the tabernacle that was prescribed to house the Torah, to house the rituals of the Torah, and to house all of the ceremony that would surround the receiving of this great piece of wisdom at Sinai. The few things we know about the tabernacle is that it took about 6 chapters of Shemot to specify it. The creation of the world takes about 2 chapters. This takes 6. It's huge. It goes on and on and on in infinite detail. And not just detail about what materials to be used, what sizes to make things, but specifically what patterns and it should be embroidered into, who should make it under what conditions, how it should be paid for, what the ceremonies were that would take place inside it. These are all things that today we would call experience design, or what Stephen would call service design. It's an elaborate front stage, backstage process that is outlined in 6 chapters of the Torah. It's absolutely gorgeous. And again, so it pays close attention to the artisanal nature of the design process, the way that people who make things, when they're making them, are conceiving them as well. I'm not sure I wrote it down, but there was a wonderful quote that I took out at some point, which talks specifically about the people who would conceive of the things being made. And it's in there for another day. But there's another aspect to this part of the story, which comes in yet another chapter, two chapters later, after the priestly class who go to attend to the tabernacle is described. There is a description of the selection process of the man, Bezalel, who would be responsible for the execution of this design. And again, he wasn't chosen. This is a huge project requiring thousands of artisans to be doing all kinds of crafts. There's no one man who can do all the gold work, the copper work, the fabric work, uh, and on that was required to build the tabernacle. But the thing that is distinctive and the first thing that's called out about Bezalel is that he should be a wise-hearted man amongst you and make all that the Lord hath commanded. So the Lord set the intention, and Bezalel translated that intention into reality. And what he needed to do that wasn't just great skill in his crafts, but a wise heart. And that wise heart is particularly important to us at Chochmat Halev, because this is the passage, exactly the passage where the name of our congregation, our community comes from. V'chol chacham lev b'chem u'bo'u v'ya'asu et kol asher tziva Adonai. Right? Let every wise-hearted man. What we need to be designers in the world, to be the creative beings who bring a world that is purposeful, that is delightful, that is sustaining of the human spirit forward, is a wise heart. And we'll get to sort of the reason why Mussar, and I place Mussar at the center of this practice. So there's another story in the creation story that is separate from the 6 days of bringing the world into existence, which is the story of the creation of Adam, which is quite separate. And again, it's seen as a story of a fall from grace, where Adam and Eve are banished from the Garden of Eden. But it's very significant to me that the transgression was the eating from the tree of knowledge. And the knowledge, I feels, through a design lens, is that knowledge of how to live outside and separate from nature, using our own imaginations and our own creative skills. And that requires a great amount of care and diligence and responsibility. So rather than just a banishment, it was a sending forth to take our place in the world in a creative way, but in a way that could be viewed as godly. All right, so that's the creation story part of things. I'm probably running way long from where I should be, so I don't know where we're going to get to this. So we're just getting now to the actual introduction to design thinking. Any sort of just comments on what we've been through? Any questions there, or anybody got to jump in? Even as I say that we're running long on the time. So let me talk a bit about design thinking. Design thinking, I call design thinking a method. Design thinking is to our creativity what the scientific method is to our curiosity. You don't have to be a scientist to be curious and to investigate the world, but it helps to know the method and to have rigor to it. And that's simply what was done when designers brought forward a method to the design process, and that's what design thinking is. It's a way of systematizing it and making it a little bit more directive and efficient. One of the places that's most closely associated with the development of design thinking is down here at Stanford, where eventually they established what they call a D school as an institute. It's actually not a school separate from any others, so that students from every part of Stanford can come and collaborate together at the D school on creative projects and learn to create, whether they're in medicine, they can learn to create new medical processes, or if they're in law, they learn to create new legal frameworks, and if they're in engineering, they can learn to develop products and new technologies. So it's really a multi-dimensional, cross-dimensional, cross-disciplinary institute that brings students from every part of the university. Again, I won't go into their diagram and the placement of empathy right at the center of things. When I was getting this tour by Larry Leifer, who's one of the founders of the D School, he was kept on repeating to me again and again. He'd say, "We're not here to teach design. we're here to teach empathy. And right there we get into a framework that takes us closer to the middot. They understood this, they recognize that empathy is what designers need, a wise heart. But a wise heart isn't necessary enough. There's many other dimensions. There's compassion, there's patience, and all of those, and we'll get to those in a second. But empathy, to do design with empathy requires a different way of designing. It requires a way of stopping and talking to people, and not just asking them what do you like and what do you want, because you'll never hear from them what you want. Empathy requires design research processes and methods that go underneath the surface of people's interests, and can look for insights into need rather than what people think they need. The designer's job is to understand at a greater level. We talk a lot about doing the design research behind empathy is really to talk to people simply about their experience with a certain thing that you're interested in designing. And that experience you'll always follow up with questions about why. Did you have that experience? Why was that interesting to you? Why was that revolting to you? Why? Because it's in the why questions that we learn. We go deeper and deeper and deeper into the core beliefs and understandings that people have. Stephen.
I really like this graphic because it has the heart and the mind balanced by way of the hand. Because understanding has a lot to do, empathy has a lot to do with understanding the link between people's thoughts and actions and their feelings and values. So I may have to ask you for this graphic, Neil, after.
Absolutely. All right. The second step in design thinking, or actually the third step, is ideation, is definition, and it's really about framing. These are all aspects of what I call the mindset of design thinking. And part of the mindset is that you can't simply just say, I want to design a new X or Y or Z. You can't frame your design challenge in terms of the object that you want, that you think is needed. So the favorite example that's always offered is the design of a better light bulb, except that if you set out to design a better light bulb, you would never ever get to what this very innovative group developed in the bottom part of the screen, which is a light source that is needed in a squatter camp in the Philippines, where there is no electricity. So rather than framing it as design a better light bulb, the frame was bring light into a place that has no electricity. And the solution that they found was they took a Coke bottle, an empty Coke bottle, filled it with water, and they found that when they sealed it into a hole in the ceiling of those shacks, it would produce as much light as a 60-watt light bulb. So suddenly you had the ability for children to study for much longer hours than they could, and to not burn paraffin, which was the only other source of light that was suffocating and very unhealthy. So it was a much broader way of looking at the challenge. You've probably heard the expression, a problem well stated is a problem half solved. That really is the challenge behind good framing of design challenges. So we'll keep these in mind. We'll get back to them. The other piece of the design thinking mindset is volume of ideas. We tend to approach a challenge or a problem with a single solution. Oh, when we do mathematical problems, you go through the formulas and you run through all the problem, and there's an answer. There's one right solution. The challenge we have in the design process or in any creative process is there's not just one right solution. There's an infinite number of solutions. And in fact, not only are there many solutions, but there are many ideas that need to be compiled to arrive at the ultimate configuration that will address our intention and address our challenge. So, as Thomas Edison said, and is widely adopted as a key principle of design thinking, to have a great idea, you have to have lots of them. You never just have one idea at a time. And so we have techniques and approaches for ideation, for actually creating ideas, an abundance of ideas, and a way of reviewing those ideas and synthesizing many ideas into new ideas. So working with ideas at a if you like, almost an objective level is very much at the center of the design thinking process. And the next mindset that really defines design thinking is the tendency towards action. We tend to want to brainstorm and have this idea, and then we think, oh, will it work? Won't it work? What are we going to do with it? Why would we do it? What design thinking tells us is when you get through your many ideas and you get to an idea that seems reasonable, make it. Right? Nothing is a mistake. This is in the big courtyard that's right at the center of the D School in Stanford, and they've got this big banner hanging up. Nothing is a mistake. There is no win and no fail. There's only make. Because once you make something, you're putting your idea for the first time out into the realm of experience. And when you can experience, you will know about it what you don't know when it's only in your head. And when you give it to somebody else to experience, you will also know something that you could never find out for yourself when you just consider it as an abstraction. So the key principle of design thinking is to start making things almost as soon as you have the idea. And to find out, because the minute you put that idea out into the world in reality, you will have new ideas, many, many new ideas. And it's the beginning of an ideas cycle that never ever ends. All right, and when
other people have ideas too.
And then other people have ideas, absolutely, and then you can start engaging in that collaborative process of ideation and creation. Um, and I'll get back to that. The prototyping, these are some prototypes of a chair that I designed when I was in college. And you can see the very first prototype was rough. I just pulled it together in a few minutes, really, to test out the basic dimensions, the basic shape, and the basic posture of the chair. And then I went through a series of what's called rapid prototypes, ways of making things really fast. And what happens when you make things really fast is you make them in what we call low fidelity. We don't make it perfect to every single dimension of the final product. We only prototype those dimensions, those functions, if you like, that need to be understood in reality, that haven't existed before, and we need to engage with them in a way that we can learn. And so you go through a series of prototypes, starting with duct tape and paper and cardboard if it's an object. Software is often done as what's called paper prototypes, where you just really sketch screens out on a page and very quickly run through the interface with users. If it's a space, you'll often see people when they're doing renovations on their house, they'll build these frame structures just to see what the massing of the house. Those are all low fidelity prototypes. And the art of low fidelity prototyping is one of the greatest skills that we can develop when we try to design our own lives, let alone a technology product or piece of furniture. And companion to the prototyping is it's not good enough just to build the prototype. You've got to test it. You've got to expose it to the world. You've got to get someone to use it in conditions that represent reality, so that you can then, based on other people using and interacting and relating to your idea, you can understand their experience by then probing, asking why questions. That didn't work for you, why? It was too big, why? It overwhelmed me, why? And we go deeper and deeper into people's experience of the things that we put out in the world. If we're doing this to design our own lives, that needs to be done as an internal inquiry, but also I don't want to underestimate the power of working with others through this. Design is not a solitary process. It's not something any one person does. When God chose Bezalel to design and make the tabernacle, there's another passage somewhere there that says, now go out and find the hundreds and hundreds of people that are going to help you do it. And they're all specified, and they're all required to be wise people as well. And actually, I put this in. This is a studio actually at Stanford. Design is a collaborative process. There's always interaction, engagement between designers, between different kind of designers. Some people would say that design thinking was invented to give a common creative language to different kinds of designers, to doctors and lawyers and engineers and technicians and artists and traditional pointy head designers like myself and Stephen. So design is a collaboration. Silva.
I don't want to be wasting time here. It seems that the discipline that I'm in has created a cognitive filter for me that makes it hard to just go along. I'm a semiotician. So asking why in my discipline is a religious question. Asking how is a political question or an engineering question. And you keep saying why. Could you say a little about why you picked why instead of how?
The how, as I say, is relatively easy. That is a technical question. And design isn't a technical discipline. Design is very, very much a discipline of the heart. And the why gets us to the understanding of the heart.
Okay. Thank you.
Stephen, do you have another way to look at that?
I just want to hear what Silva said again about the difference between why and how. I was trying to write it down real quick.
Asking why is a religious question. Asking how is either a technological question or a political question, but not electoral politics, of the people.
Yeah.
I mean, Silva, that's a subject I'd love to explore further with you in another conversation, because there's a depth to that, and the superficial way I could answer that is the design is a religious, or at least it's a spiritual pursuit. It's not necessarily a religious one, but it's, in my opinion, obviously, as you can see how I'm approaching it, it's primarily a spiritual pursuit. It is a pursuit in the creation of the world, and setting the intention and having a heartful intention is the hardest part. It's the part that we mostly get wrong when we create the kind of mess that we're often creating. It's not a technical problem, but that's a whole other.
I guess I do have a comment on that, because one of the things that we do in service design, and it happens a lot in design thinking as well, is we ignore the division of labor. We bring people from lots of different disciplines into the room and ask them not to stay inside their boundaries, but rather to try to color outside the lines and try to connect with one another and find common languages. So I think the reason why and how isn't separated in these questions that we ask in design is because we're deliberately fusing them together and into a what as well as a why and a how.
Yeah.
So what Stephen said makes me think about what project management is in high tech, which I did for 25 years. And that kind of bringing disciplines together to work as a team is something that I think we do as individual designers or artists as well. We bring all those aspects of ourselves together, and sometimes they fight with each other, but most of the time they work together well. Thank you, Stephen.
Thanks, Ronnie. All right. So this is just a slight reformulation of the Stanford version of the design thinking process. First of all, I've placed it in a circle with reflection in the center, Because one of the things, as I said earlier on, as I mentioned earlier on, is that design and education are actually very parallel in many ways, and the place that they meet is is in the reflective aspect. They meet when you put something out in the world and you reflect to learn about what it is that you put out in the world, and you build that. You then fold that reflection back into the next cycle of the process, and it's a never-ending cycle. It never stops. Silva.
Oh dear. Being a semiotician, I have a uh, uh, what does this word mean? You know, the meaning of everything. And I just lost. What was the last thing you said, please? Because there was a
That when we reflect on the things we put out in the world. So
right.
what we can learn from that reflection, we fold into the next cycle of the process.
Okay, so one of the concepts I work with is if something has a solution, it's a problem. If it doesn't have a solution, it's not a problem. It's a condition. And we accept as conditions what are in fact problems because we can't imagine the solution.
Right. And
So, but the work I do, I go into workplaces and I problematize this stuff because it's not a condition. We can fix this.
right.
Is it sort of the same operative thing?
Absolutely. In fact, the language I prefer is I very rarely, in fact, I kind of, when I teach, I try to train my students not to use the word design problem. But we fall into that, it's commonly used. I prefer to call
Yeah,
it a design challenge. We're
yeah.
always challenged to adapt to something else, and we're constantly in the process of adaptation. Design is a creative way of adapting to the world around us. Um, and nature does it by mutation and natural selection. We do it by ideation and forming. That's the human way. But yeah, it's a challenge, and we're constantly being challenged. When you don't design a beautiful house to solve a problem, you design a beautiful house because you challenge to live in a particular way. So,
Mm.
all right. So, and the other thing, oh, sorry, go ahead, Silva. Ooh, because we
No, it's okay.
We have
I,
we have to say goodbye.
yes,
is it already?
yes,
Don't we have another half hour?
It
no,
says the breakout room will close in 15 seconds.
Oh wow.
Neil and everyone, I want to take 2 minutes to just thank you and
Yeah.
thank everyone.
Thank you. Yes, this is
Thank you.
Thank you.
wonderful.
Yeah, I'm so sorry we didn't get to the exercise, but I think we